Greetings. My name is Bob Heilbrunner, and I welcome you to the second class of a 9-class series entitled Belonging to Each Other and the Planet. And I'm going to start by talking about I'm going to stop here for a minute while I find a piece of paper. So, welcome to the second class of Belonging to Each Other and the Planet. And I want to start by reviewing the basic concepts of the course, which we talked about last time, and then move on to from that to develop the notion we introduced last time of a paradigm and the need for a change in paradigm. So I want to talk about the basic concepts and the basic intentions of the course. And the basic intention is to provide sustenance and moral support and sustenance and support, and to help create a community of support for those of us who are affected by the widespread unraveling of the networks and fabric of our life that have kept us connected with each other and with the needs of the planet and nature. And to support us in living both in a recognition of the reality of what's going on, so not in denial, but at the same time with the ability to live lives of joy, gratitude, and meaning and purpose during the time that this moment that is given us to be alive on this planet. So I've described the problem as being essentially a crisis of belonging as individuals to a culture, of building a culture that people can experience their belonging in, and of belonging as a species on the planet, finding a rightful place on the planet in which we both get to be ourselves as individuals and as a species, and to be respectful of the needs of others, whether it's other human beings or the rest of the web of life and the other species involved in that. So the hope of this course is to be a support to all of us in finding and reclaiming our belonging. And that the crisis of belonging that we as a culture and as a species face right now, that we're called to heal, is basically, that we're called to heal and transform, is basically one and the same great mistake. And we use the poem by Michael White as a foundation for that. And so in talking about the great mistake, the underlying great mistake that I think is at the foundation of all of our problems, the unifying mistake that Michael White talks about in his poem called "Everything is Waiting for You." And the key lines from that are, "Your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone." And I picture him talking to a mirror when he says this, but he means individually and as a species and as a culture. Your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone. And these are key lines from the poem. And to feel abandoned is to deny the intimacy of your surroundings. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity, consciousness. And then he says, put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. So the basic point there is to support each other in finding our belonging to ourselves, each other, and the planet. So I also talked about that the cure or the healing and the antidote to this tragic mistake is transitioning from a paradigm of narcissism, that is to say, away from a paradigm that based on the notion that the world is best understood as a desperate competition for survival among opposing forces and interests, to a view of the world that I'm calling communion. So transitioning from a paradigm of narcissism to a paradigm of communion, which is a view that recognizes the communion of things, the interdependence of things, the co-creation of everything, participating and co-creating the web of life, and our utter and irrevocable dependence on the web of life for our own survival. So to support us in participating in and belonging to this transition to a world that can offer us belonging in the way that the existing one does not, um, the Course hopes to offer one, a map, um, a sort of a you are here map to orient us in terms of where we are in the scheme of things, with the idea that knowing where you are is part of belonging, being oriented is part of belonging. It hopes to offer, number two, a community of support for us to deal with making this transition, including for us to discover um, the gifts and wisdoms and talents and heartfelt interests and passions that we can offer and contribute to the transition, each of us uniquely. And also to offer, I hope to offer experiential exercises to um, support us in accessing our inherited inner compass, the inner compass that nature through our whole evolutionary journey, the inner compass that nature has gifted us, and that involves our inner resources and abilities and potentials to belong. So the evolutionary heritage that we've been bequeathed, that is a resource in each of us to find our belonging and thereby to be part of the healing of the narcissistic paradigm. And so today I'm going to start with talking a little more about the concept of a paradigm. And last time I said that the paradigm can be graphed or understood as a series of nested concentric circles in which each circle identifies a realm of our experience, including our intrapersonal realm, how we treat ourselves, the interpersonal realm, how we treat other human beings, the international realm, how we treat other nations, the interracial realm, how we treat other races, how we treat another realm of how we treat um, the other sex, um, and ultimately how we treat each other in our economic relationships, in our political relationships, in our international relationships, and ultimately in our relationship to the spiritual or the sacred. So in each of those realms, narcissism within the paradigm. There are counterforces, but in the paradigm itself, in each of those realms, um, the narcissistic paradigm persists, and in each of those realms, it can be opposed and transformed. And the basic thing of the narcissistic paradigm, I said this already, I think, basically, the slogan of the narcissistic paradigm is do unto others before they do unto you. Um, and the basic metaphors are ones of power and control and contest and conflict and war and domination. Um, so now the consequences of calling it a paradigm are a number of those. One of them is one of the potentially negative consequences is that when you look at it that way, it can be overwhelming because it's sort of got us surrounded. You could say, "My God, this has got us on every realm of our existence." Um, and it's so ubiquitous that it's almost invisible to us because just as water is to a fish, it's just the air we breathe. It's in our habits, and it's largely unconscious, which is why making it conscious is really important, and that's what we're going to be doing. Making it conscious and specifically conscious in each realm can help us to be aware and thereby um, birth something better. Um, The positive side of that view of the concentric circles is that it can be resisted at every level. It can be resisted in how we treat ourselves, how we treat our neighbors, how we treat each other, how we treat other human nations, other races, how we treat other species, how we treat nature as a whole, and how we treat spirit, how we treat the sacred, how we relate to the sacred. The other positive thing about looking at it as looking at the concept of paradigm as positive and useful and not only depressing in terms of, my God, what a monolith it is that paradigms have a life cycle. Paradigms, like everything on earth, everything from worms to humans to trees to bunny rabbits to birds, but also even mountains and rivers and continents that uplift and sink. Everything that exists has a life cycle. And everything exists that exists. And so, like everything else, paradigms are born as a correction of the blind spots of the previous paradigm. They blossom and fulfill themselves and offer something new. They wear out as their deficiencies become problematic, their blind spots become problematic, and they give birth to something new. They give birth to something new. And that's kind of our mission, is to give birth to something new within the existing paradigm, which means gathering and seeing all the places where alternatives have grown and are being grown and have been created and can be built on and are the seed of they're not in hegemony yet, but they are the seed of a new paradigm. So the new order is birthed within the old one as an ongoing and accumulated response, to the contradictions and blind spots of the dominant paradigm of a particular time. Now, this idea is not new, of course, and one of its early versions is Hegel, who talked about dialectic and talked about how ideas move into dominance, and then their contradictions lead to a correction, and that there's a correcting process in the philosophical and intellectual realm as he saw it. And then Marx, who grew up as a philosopher and a Hegelian, actually, in his intellectual life, started to say, well, let's talk about dialectical materialism, which is to say that it's not just the history and dialectic of ideas, it's actually history is also a dialectic of political and institutional and economic structures of material reality, not just this conceptual reality. Um, but in any case, the basic idea is that history moves by a self-correcting, some kind of self-correcting process. And the image for me is something like a snake slithering, right? If a snake can't go straight ahead. If a snake wants to move someplace, it has to do this. And so the process of moving and correcting and balancing and finding a balance is how progress happens for a snake. Um, but our concept of a paradigm right now includes the concepts and ideology and worldview, but it also includes the social structures and the relationships and habits that manifest that point of view, and the physical infrastructure and roads and dams and nuclear weapons that are material manifestations of that view, and also the imprints and sort of the footprint or imprints on nature. So we're talking about a both material and psychological and spiritual and whatever else you want to call it process. So I want to talk now as an example of how that works. The transition from a medieval worldview to the Enlightenment worldview, and we are right now, I think, in the final throes of the Enlightenment point of view, where what was originally progressive, the blind spots are showing. So originally, the Enlightenment point of view was a rebellion against the medieval world order. And the medieval world order was basically based on received authority. It was based on the idea that God gives power to the king gives power to the nobles give power to the people who do the crafts, and at the bottom are the peasants who do essentially the dirty work of making sure everybody has something to eat. Um, so this particular social structure was sanctified by the moral authority of the church, by religious authority. Um, and then, and that religious authority basically said that that the medieval royal power structure was a reflection of and part of the cosmology of how God created the world. Um, that it was simply a reflection of how God constructed the world, and that everyone's responsibility was to take their place obediently within the structure and authority that God had laid down. And you notice an interesting thing there, that how that works. So the social structure is projected onto a cosmology, right? Our social structure is is hierarchical. So we that gets projected onto a cosmology that says the world is that way. God made the world, and a hierarchical view with a male authority that created it, and whose authority everyone needs to obey. And so the social structure is projected onto the cosmology, and then the cosmology is used um, to authorize the social structure. That is the reason our social structure is that way, is because that's how the world is made. That's how God made the world. That's how God ordered things. And so ultimately, pretty much each paradigm ultimately is saying it's just the way it is. This is the way it is. This is of what the world is. Now, you any for to be born and live, any paradigm has to serve somebody, and generally, what it serves is a particular power structure. And in this case, this cosmology, this paradigm serves um, the medieval power structure. Um, Now, the Enlightenment was essentially a rebellion against that, and it was a rebellion against received authority and received wisdom, against received wisdom and received authority. So it was a movement to free the intellect from religious dogma, so science could go about saying, looking at the world and seeing how it is, rather than having to, scientists going to the stake because what they were seeing didn't fit the religious dogma, and to free the individual freedom, free the individual from conformity, from social conformity, from the social the confines of from social conformity, from having to conform to the social confines. So it's about freeing the intellect and freeing the individual. And that was the originally progressive response to the strictures of received authority. And the famous slogan of the Enlightenment was Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am." Now, the limitations of that are going to get clear as we move on, because it's the Enlightenment rebellion that was the foundation of morphed into and became what I'm going to call the narcissistic paradigm. So you notice he said, "I think, therefore I am," freeing the intellect, not "I feel, therefore I am," not "I love, therefore I am," not "I am nurturing and nurtured, therefore I am," not "I am full of the life force and interwoven with the rest of existence." "I think, therefore I am." So a privileging of the intellect and of freeing the individual intellect as the motor of the new thing. Now, that led to a blossoming of science and technology unlike anything we've ever seen, that was ever seen or imagined before that. So there's a huge, partially or potentially a huge positive, if you want to call it. It has its downside, but a huge positive effect. And the positive effect was an amazing growth of science and technology and of economic growth. So, and why that happened in part was the medieval system was stagnant because the surplus that was produced essentially by the peasants, the surplus that was beyond what society needed simply to feed and take care of everyone, that surplus went to the nobles, and the nobles used it for to create their culture. So to create feasts and banquets and tapestries and art and a lot, war, armor, weapons, armies. So, but it was not plowed back into the production process, that those resources did not go back into, it rode on the peasantry and the peasantry's production, and the peasantry's using their production in part to keep production going, using last year's seeds. But it did not lead to, it wasn't plowed back into the production process. It was used essentially for the social privileges and luxuries and wars of the rulers. The difference between that and the new capitalist elite was that capitalists used the surplus and reinvested it into the production process to make more profit. So they used their profit to grow more profit, to grow more profit, to grow more profit. So that means the profit, if you think of that as the social surplus, but now it's individually owned, but they use the social surplus, which they privately owned as capitalists, to increase, to reinvest it into the production process. And that led to the new God, the new growth, the new God, which was growth, economic growth. Now we're going to talk a lot about, so that's an amazing miracle, and there's an enormous amount of things that we can be grateful for that. You know, in my case, for instance, it would be a bypass heart surgery that allows me to be here today. So gratitude for that, or seeing its strengths, is appropriate. But the other piece is that the downsides, which we'll explore at some length, those appear in the course of in the course of history. And so the downsides, and again we'll talk about that more, but include things like individualism gone amok, that the surplus is controlled by giant corporations who invest to maximize their profit, whether or not they're maximizing their profit in a way that's useful for society. So the sort of greed is good ethic of capitalism, and that individuals and corporations are not accountable to the public good. That they're not accountable for their they're not accountable to the public good or the public interest, and the public, there's not a mechanism for the public interest taking precedence of private profit and private interests. And they're not accountable to the needs of the people, and they're not accountable to the needs of nature. And this also led to a science that is not accountable to the social good. And sort of the ethics of science tends to be because we can. We do it because we can. There's not an institutional system for should we do it. And just some obvious implications is genetic manipulation, which could be useful and could not be useful, but that's in the private hands and determined by whether it's profitable or not. And there's not a mechanism for making it accountable to society as a whole. And one example that I'm real aware of right now is we're moving ahead with making self-driving cars. Why? Because we can. And the people who can do it and who can make profit doing it are going to do it. And there doesn't seem to be any dialogue about, okay, what about all the people that make a living by driving cars that are not equipped to other ways, that aren't trained to alternative ways of making a living? Is that a good thing? And how are we going to support and help those people find an alternative way of making a living? Is that something society is taking responsibility for? And do we want to be on the road with robots, not with human beings? Do we want to know that in the car next door, that's not a human being, that's a machine? So the point is, because we can, and there's no, it's not responsible to or accountable to a social process. So the Enlightenment and its progressive aspects morphed into the narcissistic paradigm. And as the costs and the blind spots of that paradigm become apparent, and one of the way I think it becomes apparent, there's sort of a widespread feeling, I think, that that the economic system, the capitalist system, is sort of we're kind of on an autopilot flight, on a flight to someplace none of us wants to go, or at least none of us has been consulted about whether we want to go there. So the costs of the narcissistic paradigm at this point have become clear and unsustainable. And they include the crumbling social fabric. They include the alienation, depression, anger, and grief of huge numbers of people, the uprooting of people, endless wars and conflict, environmental destruction, extinctions, including the potential of the extinction of the Homo sapiens species, global warming. So we right now are tasked with birthing something new within the interstices of the old. We live in a narcissistic paradigm, and we're tasked by nature, if we want to survive as a species, we're tasked to take part in the birthing of something new. And that will be birthed out of, it'll be birthed out of the contradictions and the failings and the failed promises, such as liberty, democracy, freedom. It will come out, it will be birthed out of the contradictions and the failings, including the failed promises of the old. So again, the hope of this course is to support us in understanding and mapping the narcissistic process and how it affects us, to support each other in finding ways to resist, heal, and transform it, and to find our place in that process, to find out what gifts and wisdoms and passions we have to offer to the healing process. That's actually two. And the third one is to work on developing experience, to offer experiential practices that can support us in getting better and better at accessing the guidance and the resources that we have within us, the evolutionarily developed guidance and resources we have in us to learn how to belong, to find our belonging, our rightful belonging and place with each other and on the planet.